I'd love to pick your brain about GLP-1s. Do you think there's a risk of people becoming a bit dependent on the medication?
The problem with these drugs is that it dampens down food noise so much that I would say that people almost stop eating or start eating really, really small amounts of food, and often not the right type of food. A lot of people, they might gain weight through trauma, and if people aren't dealing with that, then it can make it even more fearful. What happens when this drug is removed? That trauma, any psychological issues are still there, and if the environment hasn't changed, the weight will go back on.
You've written your book, How Not to Eat Ultra Processed.
When the research first came out, it was like, oh, any ultra processed food under the NOVA definition is bad for us. But actually, the newer research shows that when you delve into the subcategories of ultra processed foods, not all ultra processed foods are bad for us.
Hello, welcome back to the show. Thank you for joining. Now, today we are going to be discussing all things ultra processed foods, GLP-1s, and how we can adapt with the ever-changing food situation that's going on around us. We live in a world where the food environment is changing faster than our bodies can actually keep up with. Ultra-processed foods are now making up more than half of the calories consumed in UK diets, which is a really frightening statistic. Yet our biology simply hasn't evolved to cope with these types of ingredients. And that, is leading to lots of obesity and chronic health issues. According to World Health Organization, global obesity has nearly tripled since 1975. And on top of that, that's now opening up a new landscape for GLP-1 medications, drugs like Ozempic, obviously hailed as these breakthrough treatments which can really help with weight loss, other health issues. But are they really a long-term solution, and are they actually healthy? That's something I really want to discuss with today's guest, who is going to help us unpack all of these questions. I'm joined by Nichola Ludlam-Raine, a specialist registered dietitian with over 15 years of clinical experience in the NHS and private practice. She holds degrees in sports and exercise science and nutrition and dietetics, has published in the Journal of Human Nutrition and Dietetics, and is the author of the best-selling book, How Not to Eat Ultra Processed. Nichola is a passionate voice in the world of nutrition, and she's here today to cut through the noise and give us all the facts, which I think we need, because there's so much crazy misinformation online about what we should be eating, what we should be doing. So thank you, Nichola, for joining on the show today.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
And I want to get a bit more into the diet side of things, but I'd love to pick your brains firstly about GLP-1s, mostly because we've heard such great things about them, but we've also heard some real horror stories. I was just reading an article, I think this week, about how there have been people reporting blindness. It's obviously a very, very severe side effect. We've had other people who've had issues with their pancreas. It's obviously something that needs to be really carefully managed. Why do you think these GLP-1s are making the headlines now?
They're making the headlines because they are the best drug that we have right now for obesity, and they replicate a gut hormone that we naturally produce. I think they're making the headlines, though, because the celebs in LA are using them, and in my opinion, they are being misused. So they are not being used as per the health criteria in the UK. They are being used by people who perhaps have got a body mass index of less than 25 and just want to shift a few pounds, and they are not meant for that.
So less than 25. I didn't realize that was the criteria in the UK. So for a BMI, if you're under 25, it's not recommended.
The criteria in the NHS is actually to have a BMI of above 35 plus comorbidities, which basically means health conditions related to obesity. However, when you look at these celebrities, they don't even come close to a body mass index of 30. So that's what I mean. They are being misused by people who they were never meant for.
And where are people getting them from then? So if you're in the UK and you can't get it from your GP because you're showing up and you perhaps don't have a BMI as high as that, or you don't have any illness associated with being overweight, where are people finding them?
So you can get them privately from online pharmacies. And what I would say is that providers vary with regards to what other support is given. And what we know is that this drug works best when in conjunction with medical support from a doctor, from a psychologist, also from a registered nutritionist or a dietitian, or very sadly, these GLP-1s are being sourced on the black market. And obviously we've had some awful things in the news with regards to hospitalization of people. And that's because these are counterfeit drugs. They are at the wrong dose. I don't know what else is in them. And there's no guidance with regards to how to use them. So that's where they're being sourced.
It kind of reminds me of when people go to overseas to get surgery, sometimes Turkey. It's not always Turkey, but I think for some people, the aesthetic has just ingrained in them so much that they just must lose the weight, or they must get that, Brazilian butt lift, or they really want to make these changes so badly that they're willing to risk their health. And that's a really frightening place to be. We have heard them described as game changers, I guess, if they're done safely, with help, with supervision, with perhaps some lifestyle changes. Do you think that's accurate, though, that they can completely change the game for people who are potentially overweight?
I think it's funny that they're called game changers now, because I've actually been working with them for, the last nearly 15 years. So they've been around since 2005 for type 2 diabetes. And what we've realized is that although these drugs can help type 2 diabetes, they can also help a whole host of other conditions and obesity. So that's the reason why they're being called game changers, because the licensing has changed, but actually the drugs haven't, although they are becoming more advanced. I think the game is changing because up until now, the only real way to lose weight when you're carrying a lot of weight is through bariatric surgery. And that's the area that I specialize in. Not everybody wants to go down that route. Obviously, it's major surgery, but it does get results, and research shows it gets long-term results. So other than a fad diet, which you start and stop and then it fails, weight goes back on, we don't really have anything else. There are drugs like Orlistat, but they come with really nasty side effects like anal leakage. So these drugs, although they do come with risks, when done in the right manner, they can be managed, and you can lose between, on average, 10 to 15% of your body weight, up to about 20%, and that beats everything else we have other than bariatric surgery.
It's really surprising that if they've been around for more than 15 years, well, since you've been working with them, why only now they've had this explosion? I guess more of them have come onto market. Some celebrities started using it, and now it seems obvious that a lot of people would be trying to get their hands on them. Is it a longer term solution? So if you are overweight and it's something you've been battling with for a very long time, is it something that perhaps you need to use long term? So it's not just a quick fix like, oh, I've lost the weight now, I can come off them. Is that dangerous?
It's a great question. And the funny thing is that these GLP-1s and also GIPs, which is a newer type of hormone, so Mounjaro combines the two together, they work a bit like blood pressure medication. So when you're on blood pressure medication, your blood pressure is low. If you come off it, then your blood pressure will likely go back up. So when you go on these drugs, your appetite is suppressed, whether that's through brain signaling or slowing of gastric emptying. But when you come off the drug, those effects will disappear. And on the NHS, they're only actually licensed for 2 years. And at the moment, we don't have that long-term data to show what else will be going on. So yes and no. It should be more of a long-term solution, but at the moment, the licensing isn't there. And also the cost, that's heavily in the media at the moment. I do wonder how long people can sustain it if they're buying it privately.
And in terms of I've been hearing it can help with things like PCOS. There's a lot of, I guess the research is still quite new, but there's a lot of claims that actually, because of the metabolic consequences, I guess, that can happen, that it actually can help other conditions. What do we know about that?
Yeah, so we've known for a long time now that it can help improve type 2 diabetes through blood sugar control, but also any obesity-related condition. So, for example, you mentioned PCOS, cardiovascular disease, reducing the risk of heart disease, stroke, metabolic syndrome, and also kidney disease, sleep apnea, which is where people don't sleep very well at night. There are risks, though. So although it improves lots of health conditions, it can also cause things like gallstones, acute pancreatitis. So that's why people have to be monitored from a medical point of view. So it can be really amazing. Definitely, I would say, as a kickstart, because not only do these health conditions improve, at a lower weight, people's confidence improves, and also you move about more easily. So then people may be more likely to exercise and work out. So that may kickstart other lifestyle positive lifestyle changes.
I'm guessing because of also the blood sugar control side of it, that actually you might feel like you've got the energy to exercise. Because I think if you're struggling with the ups and downs, it can kind of be exhausting. And it's a similar approach. Like I have a friend who's a doctor, and she said, oh, in the past, for people who've got depression, sometimes just having even a low dose of an antidepressant, just that little kickstart can really help to just put the wheels in motion to actually make these lifestyle changes. So if it's used like that, I think that's probably a really good thing for a lot of people. I'd love to know, I mean, it's hard to find the stats because, I mean, it's still such a new thing, this explosion in the drug, that it's very unclear at the moment what's the percentage of people, how many of them are getting them properly prescribed and how many aren't. Do you think that's a real area for concern now?
It is, because I think people are taking them, they're almost being misled that it is a skinny jab. And all it does is it dampens down food noise, which will help to control your weight, but that it will not improve your health unless you make lifestyle changes alongside. And by that, I mean eating enough protein, having enough fiber, getting your 5 a day, and exercising. Plus you've got the sleep and the stress. So health isn't just down to one pillar of weight. And I think that's the big issue. An example that I can give in clinic. So in bariatric surgery, I've got patients who post-op, they still want a little bit more. And one patient started taking the GLP-1s. And when I spoke to her, it's almost as if we'd never really spoken before. And it's like we'd gone back to the 90s where eating less equals good. It's a positive thing. And actually, we had to have a big conversation. Luckily, it worked. But through eating for your gut health, eating to nourish yourself at a metabolic level, not forgetting about the quality of your hair, skin and nails, which people really latch onto, as basic as it may sound. But that's a really motivating factor, especially when you're losing weight, because you've got an increased risk of hair loss. So the problem with these drugs is that it dampens down food noise so much that I would say that people almost stop eating or start eating really, really small amounts of food, and often not the right type of food, because you can get away with having a handful of crisps or the odd biscuit and you do not feel hungry. So malnutrition for me is the biggest risk factor and the biggest red flag that is going alongside these GLP-1s.
I've heard alongside that, I guess, is the problem with the muscle mass and how the muscle can really deteriorate if you're not eating right.
Yeah, so we don't think that these GLP-1s cause muscle loss per se. However, they do when you are losing weight rapidly and not eating enough protein and not doing resistance exercise. So typically in my clinic, I would use BIA, body analysis, to look at fat mass and muscle mass. And what we find is that if people are eating enough protein, so typically I usually aim for around 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of ideal body weight a day. So not per kilogram of body weight, but ideal body weight. So what your weight would be at a BMI of 25. So if they're having enough protein and they're doing resistance exercise at least twice a week, that might be through body weight, or it might be lifting weights, kettlebells, dumbbells. It doesn't have to be in the gym. We can usually see about 70% of the weight coming from fat as opposed to muscle. You will always lose muscle on a calorie deficit when you're losing weight, but the key is trying to preserve as much lean muscle mass as possible for two reasons, really. A, to keep up your metabolic rate, and B, for strength. 2 years down the line, you want to be strong and lean and healthy. You don't just want to be slim and have lost a ton of weight because you've lost a load of muscle mass and you've damaged your metabolism along the way, because that will lead to weight regain, yo-yo dieting, regaining even more weight than what you just lost.
Yeah, and that's something actually we've spoken about on the podcast before with dietitian Ro Huntress about how yo-yo dieting can kind of change your set weight each time, which is really fascinating. This kind of rapid weight loss, your body sometimes thinks you're going into starvation mode, and it might actually, if you sort of start eating again, hold on to more weight. You might put on weight quite quickly. So do you think this is something that people need to take really seriously when they're even considering weight loss?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people may have heard of this starvation mode. I like to call it metabolic adaptation. It basically means your body is adapting to burning fewer and fewer calories. So actually, in my clinics, I spend most of the time getting my patients to eat more of the whole foods, but actually more calories. If somebody is on 600 to 800 calories, that is not enough. I try and get people, above that 1,000 calories, above 1,200 to help protect that, your basal metabolic rate, basically. So my philosophy is trying to eat as many calories as possible whilst achieving your weight loss goal, because then you can always tweak it. But if you are starting on 600 to 800 and you're doing that long term, you've got nowhere to go, and you'll be losing muscle mass. You won't have the energy to work out, and you'll have that metabolic adaptation.
Do you think there's a risk of people becoming a bit dependent on the medication, or maybe even addicted to the weight loss, taking it a bit too far? Because I think a lot of people, particular women at certain ages and stuff, will probably have had a moment where they've lost a few pounds and actually it feels quite nice.
Yeah.
If you're someone who's battled with weight for a long time, is it quite concerning that perhaps you could get into a bit of a spiral where you just keep losing weight, and then end up in a situation where you are depriving yourself?
Yeah, I think weight loss for somebody who's carrying an excessive amount of weight, it feels good and you start to get compliments. And then though, it can become a thing of, well, just weight loss equals positive. And if you are only relying on the scales to determine what your health looks like, that's a bad thing. These drugs, they only work on a biological level. They don't influence your environment, actually what you're eating. And most importantly, they don't address your mentality and any psychological issues. So what we know is that a lot of people, they might gain weight through trauma. And if people aren't dealing with that, then it can make it even more fearful. What happens when this drug is removed? That trauma, any psychological issues are still there. And if the environment hasn't changed, the weight will go back on. So if you are on these drugs and you're working with a dietitian and hopefully a psychologist alongside being monitored by a doctor, that's a win-win scenario, because you're building in these lifestyle measures so that if the drug is taken away at the 2-year mark, or for example, it's modified the dose, then it's fine, because there are other things in place that will help your weight loss journey to continue, or that weight loss will be maintained.
I was in a chemist and there was a lady there who was trying to get her weight loss medication, and the chemist had run out. And she said she'd been trying to get hold of it. This was a while ago. I think there was a period of time where actually it wasn't quite as available as it is now. It's maybe a year ago or so. She was having an absolute meltdown and like screaming at them, because it just, to me, really looked like she clearly was having some kind of anxiety attack because she couldn't get hold of the medication. And that is a frightening reality for some people, I guess.
It's really sad. And I would bet that that lady is perhaps using the drugs without support, because if you've got a support network, you can go back and you can have a discussion with a healthcare professional. What are we going to do? We can't get hold of the drug for a few months. What are we going to do instead? Because we produce GLP-1 naturally. And if you are eating the right types of foods regularly, hopefully we will be able to maintain a good appetite over the day with adequate fluid, adequate sleep. So there are other things that we can do to help you along the way.
In terms of when you're coming off them, so if someone has lost a lot of weight and they've reached a level where they've perhaps changed their lifestyle and they've got some new patterns going on with exercise and they think they can try coming off them, are there any particular nutrients or dietary kind of patterns you would recommend for people trying to come off them?
I mean, you can't beat a Mediterranean style pattern of eating, but ultimately I've mentioned protein before, and protein is really important to keep up. Ideally that 1.6 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight a day, but spaced throughout the day, and ideally predominantly from foods. So as dietitians, registered nutritionists, we focus on a food first supplement to enhance. A lot of my patients do take protein supplements, for example, might be a bottle of protein water, but that's just a top up. That's in addition to the Greek yogurt or kefir for breakfast. It might be meat, fish, lentils, beans, tofu, a variety of different sources, but also not forgetting about fiber. So we know that GLP-1, well, is produced in the intestine, in the gut, and fiber helps us to feel full. It feeds your gut bacteria, which in turn influences our immune system, mood, a whole host of other bodily functions throughout. So trying to aim for that 30 grams of fiber. So that's why I said that protein and produce. Is it carrots and hummus? Is it berries and yogurt, nuts and dried fruit? Alongside an adequate amount of fluid spaced throughout the day. And that's in conjunction with movement, stress management, sleep. And often with my clients, I might focus on sleep first before telling them to change anything to do with their diet, because if you're sleep deprived, it can be really hard. The main thing though that I would say, and I've mentioned hydration, it's the reliance on energy drinks and quick fixes and, biscuits. You can have these within the diet, but it's not relying on them. So it's relying on whole foods to give you energy and then enjoying those soul foods in moderation.
When you're stuck in that loop, as someone who's actually been through that in the past, years ago, where you just, I just need some sugar because I'm feeling exhausted, or, chocolate, whatever it is, carbs, it's quite hard to come off them if you've got a lot of it in your diet already. Do you recommend a gradual change, or perhaps trying to do almost like a cold turkey type thing, which is what I did, but I know that doesn't necessarily suit everyone?
Yeah. Cold turkey does work for some people. I would say not for the majority. The stance that I take, and one that I've got in my book, is to start with a food diary and work out what is going on for you right now. And then ask yourself, what's the smallest change that's going to make the biggest difference? And that's going to be different for everybody. Whilst you're doing a food diary, I tell people to do reasons why. So not only write down what you're having, but why. Is it out of head hunger, which is cravings? In which case, we might modify your home environment. We might move the biscuit tin from next to the kettle to an inconvenient location. Might have a fruit bowl out on the side. Is it down to heart hunger, which is emotions? So coming up with if-then coping strategies. If I'm feeling stressed, then I'm going to go outside. Or is it down to stomach hunger? And that's just because you've missed lunch, or lunch didn't have enough protein or fiber. So that gives you so much information. Doing that reasons why, you can work out, am I eating or relying on those foods out of head, heart or stomach hunger? Because that will then lead you into what change do we need to make. And the body does not like to be deprived, or the mind. So never say to yourself, I'm never eating chocolate again. Say to yourself, right, do you know what? I've identified that I'm not having enough protein or fiber throughout the day. I need to have regular meals, and focus on what you should be doing more of rather than less of, and build in what you love. So, for example, I eat chocolate nearly every single day, but it's portion controlled, tends to be above 70%. If I want to have a bit of, Galaxy on the weekend, I will have it. Never deprive yourself, but focus on those whole foods.
That's a really good point, because I think a lot of people who have got their routine and they've got their comfort foods that they turn to, whether it's sugar, whether it's carby foods that make them feel relaxed in the moment. I think when they think about making changes, they imagine depriving themselves 100%, and that sounds awful. And actually the reality is, once you find your happy medium, and you've got your kind of balance, it's fine to have these treats in moderation. And actually, I guess, once you get into a pattern of not having them so frequently, you don't actually want them so frequently. I guess also, one thing, I don't know what you think about this, but one thing that helped me a lot was actually looking at my plate. So instead of just making a bowl of pasta with some tomato sauce and cheese on top, which was something that I would do very frequently, is looking at my plate and thinking, where is the fiber? Where is the protein? It's the satiety afterwards, that feeling of fullness, and actually realizing, oh my goodness, I had my lunch like hours ago, 5 hours ago, and I'm still okay. Like, I'm not dying. I think if you feel like you're dying, that feeling of hunger and rage. Like, I used to get it sometimes, you'd be out running around and I'd pick up a snack and I'd have sweets or something just to pick me up, because I would feel so low in energy. And if you actually, I guess, look at your plate and really become very mindful about what's on it.
Yeah, that's a great example of managing stomach hunger. So on a plate, it might be that a third is for your veggies, a third for your carbs, ideally whole grain, a third for your protein, whether that be plant-based or not. But not only that, taking it back a step further and actually allowing yourself time for lunch. So one of my patients, she would skip her lunch break. It was 15 minutes, so that she could finish 15 minutes early. But what transpired is that she'd be in and out of the kitchen, grazing, going for these quick options all day, not feeling satisfied or energized. So we actually made a discussion that in the morning, when she was making her daughter's lunch, she would also make something for her, even though she was working from home, and she'd pop it in the fridge. And we actually said, enjoy your lunch outside, soak in some vitamin D, get it outside in nature, but give yourself time. So first of all, allow yourself that lunch break and to have something to eat. And then second of all, like you said, make sure that it's balanced and nourishing. So then it will get you through the afternoon. And then you're less reliant on these fizzy drinks or energy drinks, which actually, they they do something short term, of course they do, but they don't do anything long term. And what I sometimes say to patients is that, especially those who are experiencing emotional hunger, is that food is a temporary pacifier of emotions. It distracts you from the emotion, it dulls it. So if you're feeling stressed at work and combined with the fact that you haven't had lunch, biscuits make you feel good in the moment for several moments. But then what happens is that moment goes, and then you might even feel guilt, and it hasn't nourished you psychologically or physically. So it's about taking a step out of the situation, doing some breath work, going outside in nature and reevaluating, actually, even if you have had a packet of biscuits, it's fine. There's another meal, and what are you going to nourish yourself with? And also, what are you going to do the following day? You're going to make time for your lunch. You're going to move the biscuits away, or maybe put a couple in sandwich bags so that if you really want some biscuits, it's already pre-portioned. So there are lots of these nudges that you can do when you're feeling in a positive state, healthy crudités chopped up with some dips in the fridge that will nudge you towards healthier changes without you feeling deprived, because you're actually eating more.
I'm curious, so with your clients, do you sometimes see that people who come to you have kind of reached breaking point? Because I think there's a lot of people out there living like this where they know they're making the wrong decisions for their health. They know they're having too much alcohol. They know they're having not enough fiber in their diet, but they are in this loop and it's hard to change anything because you're used to living a certain way. Do you find that with some of your clients, it's actually they've reached breaking point? So they've had a health crisis, or they've been overweight for a long time and they can't deal with it anymore. What are you seeing in your clinic?
Two things I think forces a person to all of a sudden realize that they need to make some changes. Firstly, it might come from a health scare, either for themselves or for a loved one, often a parent, and they are thinking, I don't want to go down that route, I don't want to get diabetes. Or secondly, the physical amount of weight is making life so difficult that it's really impacting their quality of life. They're getting shortness of breath. On an aeroplane, they're unable to sit in one seat. They're unable to get on a fairground ride with their children. So a lot of the time in clinic, I hear, I want to run around with my kids or even with my grandkids. So I think two things, it's the desire to improve quality of life and then the desire to stay away from disease. Because a lot of people, even with a body mass index of maybe 40, they might have everything above board from cholesterol, blood pressure, blood glucose, but they know that around the corner in 10 years' time, things may not stay that way.
For anyone who really wants to make changes, but they just don't feel they can, what would you say to them? Because one of the main reasons is just these self sort of limiting beliefs that we all have in various areas of our lives. And for some people, their limiting belief is, this is who I am. I love food, or, I need my snacks, or I need these things to kind of help me get through the day. What would you say to those people about change?
I'd say you can make change. Start with something really small, but do it alongside support. So reach out to your GP because they will be able to signpost you to what we call tier 3 options. It might be online support, it might be group support, it might be telephone support, depending on what you need. So there is support out there, but just start with one small thing. When you're feeling positive, is it the fact that you're going to meal plan? Not every single meal, it might just be breakfast. Or, for example, is it the fact that you're going to swap from your fizzy drinks to water? Make one small change because that change will lead to you feeling good, a sense of achievement, and it will give you the confidence to make even more changes.
I love that. You've written your book, How Not to Eat Ultra Processed, which is becoming a harder and harder thing to do these days. How would you define a UPF in simple terms? What are they?
Yeah, so this is half the problem actually, because the globally agreed, or not agreed definition, I believe is flawed. So ultimately, ultra-processed foods are formulations created in factories, and they contain lots of ingredients that you wouldn't usually find in a home kitchen. So you're talking additives, emulsifiers, colorings, preservatives. However, the ones that are quote unquote bad for us or not great for us when consumed in large quantities are the ones that are low in fiber, low in plants, low in protein, and low in nutrients. So the question is, why are these foods so bad for us? It's not the fact that they contain a single preservative that's above board and it actually keeps that food safe. It's the fact that The concoction of additives combined with low protein, low fiber makes them easy to consume. So then people eat them faster. So then people consume more calories at the expense of whole foods. So we know that whole foods, rich in fiber, rich in plant-based protein, rich in nutrients, is really good for our health. So the question is almost not what are you eating, but what aren't you eating?
It's interesting. I guess most people don't see it that way. I guess with ultra processed foods, we think of like the really bad stuff, sweets, crisps, things like that, which we know are bad for us. But are there foods that could be labeled as, health foods, but actually they're quite ultra processed and they've got some potentially harmful things in there?
Yeah, so this is what my book delves into. It delves into the fact that ultra processed foods come on a spectrum of health. And when the research first came out, it was like, any ultra-processed food under the NOVA definition is bad for us. But actually, the newer research shows that when you delve into the subcategories of ultra-processed foods, not all ultra-processed foods are bad for us. So you just mentioned sweets. The worst offenders, quote unquote, things that we should be limiting are the sugary and fizzy drinks, the processed meats, the takeaways that are really high in fat, confectionery, the foods that are really high in fat, salt, and sugar that taste amazing and you can have it in small amounts, but ultimately they're not great for us. The foods that are technically classed as ultra-processed but are not linked with disease are your, for example, plant-based milks that are fortified with nutrients like calcium and iodine, your wholemeal bread, because the food matrix, the fibre in there is protective, the plant-based products, even the low sugar dairy products that may contain one ingredient that you wouldn't normally find in a home kitchen, they are not linked with disease risk. So the funny thing about ultra processed foods is that my hummus in my fridge is technically classed as ultra processed because it's got that preservative in it, and my kidney beans because of the firming agent. You cannot compare them with a bag of Skittles or a Mars bar. So I think the conversation over the last year, I think people have got themselves down a rabbit hole that they think UPF equals bad, and they are trying to cut it all out, which is good if it drives you to eating more whole foods, but also it's created this huge health anxiety where people are literally questioning what type of kidney beans. Just add the kidney beans to your chili and give them a rinse beforehand, and don't sweat the small stuff about the hummus, because we're also living in a cost of living crisis here. And so, yeah, I think I just want to get the message across that UPF doesn't mean bad. If it forces some manufacturers into reformulation, great. But also I think some manufacturers have taken it a step too far. So Marks and Spencers are amazing. They're leading the way. But for example, they produce the one ingredient cornflakes. Cornflakes are actually quite low in fiber. And if they've only got one ingredient, that means that it's not fortified. So I would rather that my child, for example, has Weetabix, which is high in fiber, technically classed as a UPF, but it also contains iron and other nutrients. So my child would be healthier having had that Weetabix versus the cornflakes.
Do you think with social media and stuff, things have been very black and white now? They've become black and white. They're labeled good or bad. And actually, there's a lot of foods that actually are neither like the best thing or the worst thing. And actually, there's somewhere in the middle. And it's also that perfection thing that perhaps we shouldn't try to do that, because it's going to be almost impossible.
Yeah, human beings, we love simplicity and we love black and white. And I remember I used to do supermarket tours, and a patient once said to me, a diabetes patient, I really wish they'd put all the healthy products suitable for diabetes in one aisle. And I said, well, they kind of already do that. It's the first section in the supermarket. It's the fruits, the veg, the potatoes. But yeah, I think people have jumped on a bandwagon, perhaps maybe before this new research has come out, and they think that just because a product contains one preservative, it's going to have a negative impact on your gut health, for example. That is not the case. If you have a high fiber diet that's mainly full of whole foods, those 20% soul foods, 80-20 rule, will not do you any harm. And actually, it might be more damaging if you do overly restrict those foods, because it may lead to missing out on social scenarios like birthday parties or nights out with your friends, which we know that social connection does wonders for our health as well.
What are your thoughts on those meal replacement drinks? Because there are a few brands, which I won't name, which are huge now. And they are offering different, flavored shakes, and they are supposedly, complete meals. They are definitely ultra processed. There's been more talk of, in the future, for sustainability reasons, we may need to be having more of those types of brands in circulation for people to be getting their I guess, daily food. Do you think they are healthy?
Meal replacement products, again, come on a spectrum of health, and I could line them up into ones that I think you should be having more of than less of. Ultimately, it lies in the ingredients list. If that meal replacement product is based on whole foods, foods that you would normally have in your kitchen anyway, then I don't see any problem in that. The meal replacement shakes that are based on almost fancy words for sugar or really refined carbohydrates, yes, they shouldn't be used as a long-term solution. And I would still somebody rather have a whole food. But if you're in a scenario where there's two choices, three choices, it's either missing a meal, having a healthy meal replacement shake, or grabbing some fast food, I would rather that person have that healthy meal replacement shake.
Mm-hmm. I mentioned at the start about how we've evolved, and as we've evolved, we haven't really caught up with the way that the world has changed with ingredients and food. Do you think that, there's been an explosion of people with digestion issues, IBS, I guess dysbiosis in their gut, complaining of mystery symptoms where they bloat after eating certain foods, so intolerances to a lot of things. Do you think that's just a real reflection of how we're just putting things in our body which we can't necessarily cope with, and our digestive system is having these kind of reactions as a result?
That definitely could be part of the conversation. And it's certainly true for example, certain sweeteners, the sugar alcohols in large amounts, they can cause really bad gut upset, especially if you're sensitive. But also, if you are having large amounts of these foods, the question is you're not having enough of the whole foods. And we know that the average person is only having about 18 grams of fiber, not the 30 grams that we should be having every single day. So because we're missing out on that fiber, that's leading to that dysbiosis, which basically just means our gut is not optimized. So in order to have a healthy gut, which influences everything throughout our body, you need to have A, enough fiber, but B, a variety of different fibers to feed those gut bacteria. And yeah, if you're having a lot of these what we call HFSS UPFs, high in fat, salt, sugar UPFs, you will categorically not be having enough fiber or enough whole foods, which the colourful whole foods also provide polyphenols and antioxidants which protect against cancer. So if you want to reduce the risk of cancer, have enough fibre, have enough polyphenols, don't smoke, don't spend too much time in the sun, don't sweat the small stuff. Small amounts of these products are okay. It's the quantity that matters.
Do you get frustrated in the supermarkets when you walk around and just see how many of these foods exist and how cheap they are, and just the volume to me is what is quite overwhelming when I go into the supermarket, because usually I get an online delivery, but if I ever step foot in a supermarket and you just see these brands with the big colors, with the big logos, the writing, there's so many, and it's no wonder that people are struggling with their health and suffering with obesity and things like that.
Marketing has a lot to blame, and especially when it comes to marketing for children, and these really colourful boxes with cartoons on products which children should not be having every single day, certain types of cereals that are not high in fibre. Things are changing though, so there are legislations coming in now where 2-for-1 is going to be limited on these higher fat products. You pester power at the till, so these products cannot be at the till, but that at the moment that doesn't apply to all shops or outlets. In a train station, I've once gone in there, and yeah, I think it's train stations and petrol stations that sadden me the most, because if you go in there with even good intentions that you want to buy something that's going to nourish you physically, it is really hard. And that's speaking as a dietitian, and that's what mortifies me the most. So I would like to see a change for on-the-go items. A top tip though, if you're buying a meal deal, most of the mains, they're going to be ultra-processed, the sandwiches. Get something that's high in fibre like a whole grain wrap, but make sure that the sides are not ultra-processed. Go for a water, go for fruit. So I just think it's meeting yourself in the middle, where you're at right now. You don't have any food on you, you're starving. What's the best choice that you can make in that scenario? Sometimes those whole food bars do exist, the ones that are based on oats, dried fruit and nuts. Go for them over the chocolate bars. Even crisps. Crisps are not a health food, but they come on a spectrum of health. You've got the crisps that are maybe 3 ingredients, potatoes, oil, salt, and then you've got the crisps which aren't even legally crisps, once you pop. And I would rather somebody have slightly shorter ingredients list. It may help with overconsumption than the other, but don't be fooled. Just because that crisp is technically not ultra processed, it doesn't make it good for you.
Yeah. I'd love to know, when I meet people like yourself who work in this industry and you've got family, I'd love to know what your household looks like. So do you do a lot of meal prep? Is that something, I guess you've got children to think about as well, not just yourself. So that's busy. You've probably got a lot going on. But how long do you spend maybe prepping and what kind of things do you like to add in?
Yeah, so I've got a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old, and things are further complicated because the 6-year-old has got multiple food allergies, including dairy, egg, and certain nuts. So I fundamentally rely on some of these technically ultra-processed foods to feed my child a healthy, balanced diet. So he has oat milk that is fortified with calcium and iodine, technically ultra-processed. It's healthy. They have fish fingers with omega-3 in. I would say I don't meal prep per se where I spend 3 hours on a Sunday. Do not have time for that. But I do employ things like cook once, eat twice. Like we make things like chicken curry. We will serve it with broccoli on the side. We'll make a bolognese. We always add kidney beans. There are a couple of changes, though, that I have made personally since writing the book. So I started writing the book last January. And through the research, it did put me off fizzy drinks. Obviously, that's not related to my children, but I used to maybe treat myself to a Diet Coke, maybe on a weekly basis. I don't do that anymore. I might have sparkling water or maybe even like a slimline tonic, but I've kind of gone off those foods. And one change that I have made as a family is the bread that we buy. So not all the time, but most of the time, we will go for a sourdough, whether that be branded or supermarket own brand, just because I figure, because there are questions, and because it will help my child's health and gut health, and we eat bread a lot, maybe once or twice every single day, we have swapped bread. So that's one thing. And the other slight change is the tinned coconut milk, because in my book, I talk about 3 emulsifiers that I've kind of got question marks around. And I think if certain substances have got question marks around them and you can easily avoid them, then why not? So tinned coconut milk, I'll try and buy it without these certain emulsifiers in, P18 CMC.
Oh, that's a really good tip. I use tinned coconut milk all the time and I haven't checked for that. So thank you. Yes. In terms of like the link between ultra-processed foods and obesity, what is the kind of scientific link that we know about?
Fundamentally, it's down to eating rate. So basically, these foods are so highly processed that we eat them quicker. It doesn't require much in the way of digestion. And so you've got this, what we call passive overconsumption, the overconsumption of calories without realizing it. And that is fundamentally what it is, because they are so lacking in that protein, in that fiber, you don't have the fullness and satiety. So it just drives you to eating more. And let's say a typical pattern of eating, maybe for somebody before bariatric surgery or before GLP-1s, might be fueling their day on, it tends to be a diet drink, maybe up to 2 litres a day, but then getting to the end of the day and then realising that you're so starving, then going for takeaways, and it almost starts a bit of a binge really, and then in the evening turning on TV and then association, having these high fat sugar foods which are not filling but fill you up in the moment.
I feel like with these things, it's like once you have a couple of things. So I've noticed it a lot when I go away on holidays, even if I'm not, so I don't really drink alcohol and things like that, but even if I just have, I don't know, I guess a bit more carby stuff. So like pastas more, like I was in Italy earlier in the summer and then every night I was craving pasta after that, and I wouldn't normally eat it that much. Or you just get out of a routine. If you start having some of this stuff, it kind of leads you to want more of it. It's crazy, isn't it? And one bad weekend can actually set you off for days afterwards, craving all these things that you perhaps wouldn't usually have.
Yeah, I talk about slips, trips and falls in my clinic. So if you have a bit of a slip up, it's about rationalizing it and actually just trying to learn from what's going on. Trip ups might be like a weekend. It's very rare, though, that somebody would actually fall back into how their behavior was before you might started making lifestyle change, because you almost, you know too much. So I always try and say, if you've had a bit of a slip up, just be kind to yourself and think, Like, what can I do better next time? Or just rationalize it. I remember one patient came in and said, oh, Nichola, I'm having sweets every day. And she was beating herself up, which was then leading to other damaging health behaviors. And actually, we think I Googled it and I was like, it is 100 calories. 100 calories out of the day, you know, you're within your free sugar allowance. I was like, if you really want those, you can have them. And often, just by allowing yourself that food, it takes the onus off it. It takes the health, you know, the halo around it, the desire to have it. So I would say having these, I'm not a fan of cheat days or cheat weeks. What I am a fan of is including your favorite foods more regularly. And just remembering, if you go on a 1 week holiday out of the year, it's 1 week out of the year. Yeah. You know, just gradually get back on track and just nourish yourself and just don't beat yourself up.
I'm curious, why aren't you a fan of cheat days?
Because in certain circumstances, it's almost like there's good food and bad foods. So if you have a cheat day, well, what does that cheat day look like? Is it full of all these bad foods that are on a pedestal that you're banning from your life? Because as human beings, we're not robots. And what we'd want to avoid is that binge restrict cycle. So all foods are allowed. It's the portion size and frequency in which we eat all foods that matters. So if you do allow yourself, you know, a takeaway once a week, yeah, like great, enjoy it, sit down, have it mindfully. But yeah, try and get out of the idea of cheat days, because I would say that leads to good and bad, black and white thinking when it comes to health. And actually foods, you can't put them in a good and bad pile.
I'd love to get your view on, I've asked many guests about seed oils. I'm guessing it features in your book because they are a hot topic. Hard to avoid. Jury is out somewhat about whether they're good or bad. A lot of people that I've had on the podcast have said they're okay they're fine in moderation, that you don't actually need to worry about them as much as perhaps we think we do. What do you think?
So the term seed oils is almost a pretty, I would say, like new term. You know, before I would talk about vegetable oil or rapeseed oil. What we know from the science is that if you replace saturated fat with unsaturated fat, of which rapeseed oil and olive oil is rich in, you have better health outcomes. So I would say when it comes to cooking, ideally, yeah, you've got your olive oil, as long as it's not too high a smoke temperature, it's not going rancid, or rapeseed oil. The problem lies, I think, in that a lot of these ultra-processed foods contain these seed oils. So then we think, oh, because they contain seed oils, that's the bad thing. Whereas actually, it's everything else that's going alongside, and what these ultra-processed foods don't contain, that's the issue. So yeah, seed oils are A-okay, especially when it's, you know, rapeseed oil. It's used, it might be cold pressed on a salad or refined, which is more heat stable in cooking. So yeah, I've got no problem with rapeseed oil and olive oil. The problem lies in the ultra-processed foods.
With turning and learning your ingredients, I've heard people say, is a good thing to do. So when you're in the supermarket, I guess if you want to just keep tabs on what it is that you're putting in your body, and you turn around to the ingredients, if there is a lot of stuff on there that you don't recognize, is that a good tip to put it back?
Yes and no. I would say if a product contains a whole list of ingredients that you just do not recognize, hardly in a Whole Foods, then it's probably a red flag that it's an ultra-processed food that you shouldn't be having a lot of. If, though, it contains, like, say, one ingredient that you don't recognize, or a whole host of them, but they're actually vitamins, that's when that thought is almost flawed. So adding vitamins, like, for example, to breakfast cereal, doesn't turn that breakfast cereal, you know, into an ultra-processed food ingredient that you should avoid. So I think it's always questioning, what is that ingredient? Maybe looking it up. And if there's just one in there, you know, that's not a problem. The problem lies when there's a concoction. And like the other day, I was on the train and I did order a sandwich because I was interested. I normally go for something different. I normally go for the curry or the salad box. And I ordered the sandwich and it did contain, you know, about 100 ingredients. That's not something that I will have every single day because I'm not on the train every single day. If you are, though, you may want to vary or maybe take your own sandwich to make it higher in whole foods and less in these additives. So the additives, I wouldn't say, most of them are not bad on a molecular level. It's the concoction of them that drives overconsumption at the expense of whole foods.
That makes a lot of sense. Before we wrap up, Nichola, I'd love to know what you think is from your book, which people can buy now, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
What's the kind of biggest single takeaway you would suggest that people can just be really mindful of when they're ordering, you know, their online shop, when they're in supermarkets, when they're busy, trying to make quick decisions about what they have to eat?
I would say just to remember that it's not about good and bad foods. It's the portion size and frequency in which we eat all foods that matters most. Remember that 80-20 rule. 80% of the time, those whole foods, those nourishing foods, that leaves time for those 20% soul foods. And it's about enjoying those in moderation, with friends, with social connection. So yeah, it's moving away from that, this food is good, this food is bad, because that's not the case when it comes to the science or health.
Amazing. Nichola, it's been such a pleasure talking to you today. Your book, How Not to Eat Ultra Processed, is out. Where can people buy it? Where can people find out more about you?
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. You can buy my book from all good bookshops, WH Smith's, Waterstones, also online on Amazon. And I usually hang out over on Instagram, Nick's Nutrition, NICS Nutrition, and also Mummy Nutrition if you've got kids. That's where I keep all the lifestyle content.
Love that. Yes. I love your Instagram. You're doing some brilliant content. So everyone go and follow Nichola now, and check out her book as well. Nichola, thank you so much for coming on the Health Review.
Thanks for having me. Loved it.